Degrowth is a multifaceted paradigm and movement that charts alternative environmental, social, political, and economic relations while critiquing the ideology of economic growth. In particular, I'll focus on economic degrowth in this video. Economic degrowth advocates that we decarbonize and gradually and increasingly wean off of fossil fuels ever more each year. And this, they acknowledge, will require a carefully planned economic contraction. More on this later. However, before I describe economic degrowth in depth, I want to share some brief context that highlights why it's important we show restraint in our economic activity. After all, economics and ecology are highly connected. The Greek roots of ecology translate to the study of the house or home, while the Greek roots of economy translate to the management of the house or home. How can we look at one without looking at the other? So, to start then, economic degrowth matters because globally, humanity's ecological footprint is such that we're using 1.5 Earths. Again, our overall ecological footprint is that we're using 1.5 Earths. I'll explain what this means. This means that we're in a state of overshoot and have exceeded ecosystems' carrying capacity by using resources faster than they can regenerate on their own. By resources, I have things in mind like trees, fish within fisheries, or topsoil for agriculture. This excessive use of resources, of course, leads to a net degradation of ecosystems. Put differently, looking at all humans combined who are living today, we're using resources at a rate that is excessive given the size of planet Earth, and which would only translate to using resources at a steady state equilibrium or a steady balance between give and take if this planet happened to be 1.5 times larger than it really is. Clearly, this trajectory is not sustainable. However, it's important to recognize that this resource extraction is highly uneven across different countries. For example, if every person in the world lived the high energy American lifestyle, then we would need an estimated 5 Earths, while poorer nations throughout the global south currently consume far less energy. Then, within the United States alone, the military and the wealthiest top 1% consume far more resources and energy than those who are less affluent or are living in poverty. Therefore, economic degrowth specifically targets the affluent and high polluting countries of the global north, such as the United States, Canada, Western European countries, New Zealand, Australia, China, Russia, and possibly Japan. Degrowth economists suggest that we place limits on energy and resource consumption that progressively decline each year as a way of decarbonizing and tapering off fossil fuel dependence. This is important, of course, in order to curb climate chaos and ecocide more broadly. There are strong correlations between fossil fuel consumption and economic growth, as measured by its proxy, gross domestic product, or GDP. Growth, as measured by GDP, means that we're producing ever more goods each year. Currently, our economic system requires that we produce more goods this year than the last, and so on into the future. In other words, it requires constant and unending growth. Again, this economic production is tied to the use of fossil fuels. Some economists estimate that 80% of the global economy runs on fossil fuels. The correlations between fossil fuel use and economic growth could not be clearer. Therefore, the suggestion of an annually declining use of fossil fuels is sure to lead to an economic contraction. However, this doesn't mean material depravity and suffering for the populations enacting economic degrowth, although this is what critics of degrowth like to point to. Some sectors of the economy can decline while others are maintained or even elevated. The sectors that need to decline are the resource extraction industries, which are high in energy use and destroy ecosystems through logging, overfishing, oil and gas exploration, mining, and more. However, we can and should still put resources into social services like libraries, schools, preventative health care, public transportation, and so on. Sectors focused on providing services rather than the sheer production of new materials or consumer goods often use less energy and resources, and therefore services rather than production industries are easier to maintain under degrowth. So, how do we consume less energy and resources then? Well, degrowth economists say that we need to restructure economic activity, which can be broken down into the interrelations of four aspects. These are the population of a society, the proportion of them that are employed, their average annual hours worked, and the economic production per hour worked. Therefore, to shrink the economy and its energy and resource demands, degrowth economists have suggested things like caps on resource and energy usage that annually decline, as I've noted already, work time reduction, such as to part time work at 20 hours a week, a universal basic income, especially to ease the transition towards working less, fair access to land for food production, and new indicators of well being beyond the ones that mainstream economists currently use, which are relative income, affluence, and consumption levels. Indeed, many studies by economists, psychologists, and sociologists show that beyond a certain income level, further income does not boost happiness, but rather, increases in well being come from non material things, such as meaningful interactions with people or experiences doing something that you enjoy. In other words, if your basic needs aren't met and you live in poverty, you'll understandably face some degree of suffering. But once your basic needs are met and you have financial security and you aren't living in anxiety of having your basic needs being unmet anytime soon, well, then at that point, greater affluence doesn't translate to greater happiness. Therefore, degrowth suggests that we value new indicators of well being, such as community, friendship, connection with the non human world, personal development, or spiritual or religious pursuits, if that is something you're into. As an aside, I imagine that debt jubilees, workplace democracy, and collective ownership of the means of production, such as land, infrastructure, food production, housing, energy, medical care, etc., would be goals of economic degrowth as well. However, I haven't yet seen this in the literature. I now want to focus on degrowth's critique of economic growth. That is, the unending and constant growth that our current economic system requires. To be clear, the goal is not green growth, but degrowth. I'll try to make this distinction between green growth and degrowth clear to you. Let's look at the examples of solar and wind power and electric vehicles. These things could fit into degrowth and be helpful only if they can allow us to reduce fossil fuel usage and reduce our reliance on cars and the amount of time we spend driving and emitting carbon. After all, transportation is a major carbon emitter. Of course, it should be noted that investing in public transportation can do more to reduce transportation associated emissions, since many people are carpooling on buses or trains, rather than every individual owning a private car. This point shouldn't be underestimated, because even the construction of a single electric vehicle, solar panel, or wind turbine requires the mining of rare earth metals and the manufacturing of pieces in furnaces that are heated with fossil fuels. In this way, public transportation is far more energy efficient than every individual owning an electric vehicle. It should also be noted that reducing the working week to, say, 20 hours a week, as suggested before, could do much to reduce the carbon emissions associated with driving. We even saw such reductions in carbon emissions associated with transportation during the early COVID-19 lockdowns. However, on the green growth side, solar and wind power and electric vehicles can be marketed and implemented within an economy that remains focused on growth. This is what we have now. These technologies come into the economy, and yet we are still pursuing constant and unending growth. What we're basically doing now with green growth is adding clean energy options to the marketplace, but not reducing the problematic use of fossil fuels. Green growth is essentially a greenwashed capitalism that pretends to confront the problem of emissions while its core remains intact. And this is what's driving climate chaos and ecocide. To put it differently, the overarching economic system that solar and wind power and electric vehicles gets implemented in remains the same under green growth. New tools, same system of global capitalism. Yet, what's primarily needed is a change in the economic system. The new energy options and vehicles are only secondary in importance. The new tools are great, but fundamentally, the economic system is what needs to change. Degrowth aims to change the economic system. Green growth introduces new tools within the same system. Degrowth then calls for a displacement of growth as the primary measure of socioeconomic development. The profit motive and the need for constant growth, which are both central to capitalist economics, encourages the ever-expanding exploitation of the Earth's resources and of human labor. Degrowth economists say that this simply must cease in order to relieve suffering of all kinds, now and into the future. Basically, degrowth is calling for an end to this extract and dump economy, in which we mass produce items that are poorly crafted and designed to break down quickly. And note, this is called planned obsolescence, and which then end up in landfills or oceans. Instead, degrowth economists suggest we move from an extract and dump economy into a sufficiency economy. Here, under a sufficiency economy, we would have enough materially in order to live well and not be in poverty. However, we wouldn't indulge in many of the unnecessary and luxurious items that affluent people currently consume. Of course, capitalist discourse tells us that anything short of luxury or material excess means that we'll necessarily be in shambles and suffering. This is plain false and is a narrative that encourages us to consume and to attempt to climb the economic ladder. It's a narrative that deters us from exploring other forms of meaning outside of economic sources, which would allow us to practice some restraint in our economic activity. Basically, degrowth asserts the possibility of human flourishing under material frugality and a sufficiency economy. It encourages serious reflection on the types of material items, tools, infrastructure, and technology that can facilitate living well, or what's also called the good life. Importantly, a degrowth economy or sufficiency economy would feature what's called a steady state equilibrium. I mentioned this in passing before, but I'll expand on it now. This means that there's a net neutrality between the give and take of resources, that is, between the regeneration and use of resources, such as trees, for example. After all, we use wood for all sorts of products. Under a steady state equilibrium, the resource use takes place within the limits of the ecosystem's carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the scale of use for any practice or industry that can be tolerated by that ecosystem given the relative abundance of the resource being used, and without that level of use leading to a net degradation of the resource. In other words, it's what the ecosystem can tolerate without leading to a degradation in the resource that you're harvesting or using. For example, under a steady state, trees and forests would be regenerating at the same level as they're being cut down. This is because the scale of logging would be fitted to the size of the forest and the rate at which trees are regrowing. Rather than clear cutting a forest, for example, one could cut perhaps 10% of the forest, especially those trees which are becoming diseased but still have viable wood. Meanwhile, you might replant or allow the forest's natural regeneration of trees to match the amount that was cut prior to cutting again. Although, note, given the reality of massive deforestation, which the Earth knows today, and given the many benefits of forests, such as habitat, carbon sequestration, feeding the soil food web, groundwater retention, hunting or foraging for food, medicinal plants, or the aesthetic pleasure, calm, and peace that we find there, given these benefits of forests, it may be wise to pursue a net reforestation. In other words, it may be wiser to aspire for more than a net neutrality between the use and regeneration of trees, and instead reforest and revegetate more trees than we use. To step back, notice that when it comes to interacting with any resource, such as trees, there are important distinctions between non-use, such as not using the resource at all, abuse, such as excessively using the resource, which we do today, and the middle road of sustainable use. A steady state equilibrium that achieves net neutrality between the give and take of resources, let alone a net reforestation, are in the category of wise, sustainable use, rather than non-use or abuse. I now want to make a new point about degrowth. Economic degrowth advocates an informal economy in the form of a household, neighborhood, and community economy. And it advocates we put resources into building a vibrant informal economy at the scales I just mentioned as we deliberately contract the formal global economy. Thus, degrowth aims to relocalize and turn our homes and communities into places of sustainable production rather than unsustainable consumption. For example, people growing food in their lawns, as well as having widespread community gardens, are ways of doing this. This relocalization of a community economy is important because the sheer scale of the global economy often requires additional supply chains, underlying infrastructure, and parts for repair simply to maintain itself. These accessory supply chains and transportation infrastructure that prop up the global economy are themselves incredibly far removed from people's everyday wants and needs, which the formal economy allegedly claims to serve. When an economy reaches a certain size, many of the puzzle pieces required for its functioning are not the food, housing, clothes, or medical care that people often exchange with and need the most. Rather, these accessory parts are the lubricants of the industrial economy and things we wouldn't need if we could meet our needs locally in a community economy through, for example, fair access to land for food production, and a cultural shift in even wanting to do this. These accessory parts allow profits for middleman connector industries, while also allowing the international trade that supports profits of yet other industries and companies. However, these accessory parts and supply chains, by themselves, are not necessary to our bodily health and basic needs. They're only necessary to a massive economy that happens to be wrecking the planet. Moreover, the sheer economy of scale squashes tiny communities, small businesses, and small producers who cannot compete with the economic activity of larger companies. This is because larger companies buy their input materials in bulk at a cheaper price and produce greater quantities of the finished product, allowing them to sell it at a lower price while keeping the company afloat and still profiting. The small business or small producer has to market the finished product at a higher price for them to stay afloat. Therefore, small businesses and small producers, such as those that we would need in a local, informal community economy, have their markets undermined by the larger industries. In a nutshell, then, degrowth wants us to gradually trend towards and enact small, local economic activity only. That is, as opposed to having local economic activity while also retaining a global economy. The sooner we downsize global economic activity, the less damage is done to the biosphere through climate change, and the safer our collective future becomes. There is one final point to make, and that's the distinction between the maintenance and growth of an economy. As the global economy grows larger, its maintenance costs also increase, as a larger apparatus must be supported. Thus, annually increasing amounts of energy are consumed just to maintain the pre-existing structure, in addition to the energy and resource consumption required to grow this structure yet larger. There are the maintenance costs to preserve the economy and the growth costs to enlarge it. And yet, as the economy grows larger, the maintenance costs also increase. Clearly, this too is an unsustainable trajectory. This distinction is useful because it can help us think about the economic deceleration of the future. If degrowth is not intentionally enacted, then the global economy will still decline. This will happen as planetary boundaries are transgressed, and the ecosystems that comprise the foundations of economic activity are pulled out from beneath us. If the global economy declines in this way, rather than through a deliberate degrowth, then we're likely to see two phases. First, a phase in which the economy no longer grows but can still maintain itself. That is, the maintenance costs are met, but we lack the resources for further growth. Second, this will be followed by a phase in which the global economy cannot even meet its maintenance costs, and thereafter, a net decline begins. On the other hand, if degrowth is intentionally enacted, and the global capitalist economy is replaced via intentional planning, then the steady state equilibrium we hope to reach would be below the current economy size. And hence, in this scenario too, enacting a net decline would be of the first order. In other words, a net decline in fossil fuel use and economic activity, as suggested by degrowth, appears to be inevitable when looking into the future broadly, even if degrowth isn't acted upon. The crucial difference between these scenarios, however, is that in one, the economic decline is consciously planned, while in the other, the global economy declines in an unplanned, haphazard way, and this is likely to bring socially unjust ramifications. So, which route do you find more desirable? Obviously, most people don't want to consider a decline in economic activity at all, and this discussion would instill fear in them. The fear, while understandable, I think comes from a concern that our basic needs wouldn't be met, and there would be great suffering in the process. In my opinion, this only strengthens the argument to contract the economy in a consciously planned and responsible manner. That is, in a way that reduces the polluting and destructive industries while investing in social services. I also want to say that it's possible for these social services to be community-led initiatives rather than corporate or government-led. And I hope you'll reference my video on mutual aid to learn more about why that matters. In conclusion, economic degrowth is, in my view, one of the single most important remedies to curbing the extent of climate change. However, we must be realistic, and I'm sure you're thinking it already. This directly confronts and goes against the status quo of our economic system, big time. Currently, the key pieces of the economy are owned by a wealthy minority, which we all work for them, while they collect passive income, and lots of it. Systems of power and those who pull their levers seek to perpetuate their power. Think of this as a positive feedback loop. Therefore, I sincerely hope that folks viewing this video find economic degrowth to be a highly encouraging bundle of ideas and practices. But clearly, know that it will take a persistent struggle, as is the way of overturning any entrenched injustice.